Hello and welcome to Written Words. I'm Helen and today's lesson is from our More Than a Book review series, in which we take a book that is about the written word or language, or the English language in particular, and in addition to looking at the book itself, we then use the book as a springboard for writing exercises and for further exploration. So today's book that we're going to look at is a rather large, heavy tome. It's very thick and it's called Meetings with Remarkable Manuscripts by Christopher de Hamel. It's a beautifully presented celebration of the written word, which is a very good way to start off our series. The book is divided into 12 chapters, and each chapter examines a medieval text, and it looks at the story behind it and its significance to the modern world. Many of the texts are religious in nature, and all of them are written and illustrated by some incredibly talented scribes from the past, be they monks in a scriptorium or professional scriveners. All of the books discussed have been lovingly preserved, and many of the curators and the techniques that they use are given a mention by the author and introduced to us as well. The author, de Hamel, pays great attention to detail. He is an expert in his field, but he does so in a way that's also engaging to read. You don't need to be an expert yourself in medieval manuscripts to enjoy this book. And the information is accompanied by a plentiful selection of photographs of the manuscripts themselves, as well as lots of other relevant material. The writing in the book is an excellent example of how to structure a piece of writing. It begins with a wonderfully intriguing opening sentence at the beginning of the first chapter, and that sets the tone for the rest of the book. The first sentence of the first chapter says, "At the end of this chapter, I will recount how Pope Benedict XVI and the Archbishop of Canterbury both bowed down before me on live television in front of the high altar of Westminster Abbey." So immediately the reader starts to wonder, who on earth is this person that he can command such authority and respect? He is, in fact, an expert in his field. Christopher de Hamel is a fellow and librarian at Corpus Christi College, Cambridge. He is in charge of the university's Parker Library, and he spent many years before that as an expert on illuminated manuscripts for Sotheby's. And at the end of the first chapter, it does indeed become clear how he came to be in such an unusual situation, and he includes a photograph of that moment itself. As I've already said, many of the manuscripts in the book are religious in nature, and not surprisingly, the majority of them, being from the Middle Ages and religious in nature, are in Latin. For the purposes of this lesson, though, we're going to take a closer look at a secular manuscript, a non-religious manuscript, written in English, and that is the Henwood Chaucer, one of the earliest copies of Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, which is now kept in the National Library of Wales in Aberystwyth. And Christopher de Hamel took a journey to Aberystwyth to meet with this manuscript. This chapter, like the first one, and all the other chapters in the book, opens with a fascinating statement that draws the reader in. He introduces us to a certain Adam Pinkhurst, who may or may not have been Chaucer's private scribe. If this was the case, then he was probably also responsible for another copy of the same book, now known as the Ellesmere Chaucer, and that's now located in San Marino near Los Angeles. There is a huge amount of detail in the chapter, some of it very technical. He tells us the history of the Henwood Chaucer itself. He tells us about the writing style, about the parchment it's written on. There is a huge amount of detail. However, the huge amount of detail is made entertaining because de Hamel presents it in the form of a trial, where Adam Pinkhurst is the defendant. Chaucer is a witness, we are the jury, and de Hamel himself is the judge tasked with deciding at the end of the chapter whether or not the Henwood Chaucer really is Pinkhurst's work. Apart from the manuscript itself, another key piece of evidence is a poem which was reputedly written by Chaucer, in which he reproaches someone called Adam for his careless copying. Let's now read some extracts from the chapter about the Henwood Chaucer, chapter 10. The chapter opens like this. It is not often that medieval scribes hit the front pages of the national newspapers. Chaucer's sloppy copyist unmasked after 600 years, ran the headline in The Guardian in England on Tuesday the 20th of July 2004. The story, based on a press release put out the day before, recounted how Geoffrey Chaucer, circa 1343 to 1400, author of the Canterbury Tales, had once written a short verse apparently addressed to his private scribe called Adam, entreating him to be more careful in copying. And it told how the two oldest surviving manuscripts of the Canterbury Tales had been identified as being in the same hand as a document of the late 14th century, signed by a scribe in London called Adam Pinkhurst, now revealed to be that mystery copyist himself. Then, a little later in the chapter, the trial scene begins like this. Our first witness to be called in the trial of Adam Pinkhurst has to be the manuscript of the Henwood Chaucer itself. Later, we're told, at this point, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we need to call Geoffrey Chaucer himself to give evidence. A little later after that, at last the ushers of our fictional court, convening again the next morning, are going to summon the defendant, Adam Pinkhurst, to give evidence. He does so under oath. And the chapter is rounded off with a verdict, which is introduced like this. We are now sitting around the long table in the jury room. Adam Pinkhurst is charged with being the scribe of the Henwood Chaucer, and of many other documents and literary manuscripts attributed to him. Do I think that it is proven beyond all reasonable doubt that Scribe B was Adam Pinkhurst? All eyes are waiting for my reply. Meetings with Remarkable Manuscripts is a serious book. It's a book which sets out to give us information, to tell us details about medieval manuscripts. But then the author, Christopher de Hamel, introduces this image of a courtroom. There is no real court, there is no real trial. So why does he introduce this? Why does he use this courtroom image in a book that's about a medieval manuscript? The answer is he's using it as a framing device. A framing device is a way of presenting material. Presenting a story, presenting information. In this case, it's a bit of both. It's information presented to us in the form of a story. So he uses this framing device to help us understand. It's a convenient way of presenting the information to make it more palatable, more easy to read for anyone who isn't an expert in medieval manuscripts. And if we think back to our lesson on good openings to a piece of writing, the opening to this chapter would have been a very good example of that. He sets out to grab our attention. The information on its own, the material itself, could be quite difficult to read to a layperson who doesn't have any knowledge of this subject matter. So he sets out to make it entertaining. He sets out to grab our attention from the outset so that we realise that actually this is something that we might want to know. We might want to find out more information about this because he's opened it in such an intriguing way that we want to know more. He begins by saying, "It is not often that medieval scribes hit the front pages of national newspapers." So he has contrasted two very different types of text: medieval texts and national newspapers. Medieval texts are very, very old and they're written by hand. National newspapers are very modern. They're printed. They are completely different things. And he's put the two together. And immediately we wonder, why are medieval scribes in the national headlines? National headlines are about things that are going on at the moment, things that are current affairs. So medieval scribes are not current at all. So what are they doing in the national headlines? And then he quotes the headline, "Chaucer's sloppy copyist unmasked after 600 years." And if we think back to our lesson when we compared different newspaper styles, we looked at how newspaper headline writers like to shock us, like to use provocative language. And we've got an example of that here. The headline writer is talking about unmasking someone, as if this person was a criminal. They've been trying to keep something covered up, that they've done something terrible for 600 years, and at last this criminal activity has been unmasked. And now we know that this person who was supposedly a reputable scribe is actually a sloppy copyist. It's provoking a reaction, in this case in a humorous way. And then, of course, he begins to explain what this is all about, and that Adam Pinkhurst was actually a real person, and that research has been taking place into whether or not he was actually Chaucer's copyist. And the story continues throughout the chapter. And now for our language focus. For a moment, we're going to move away from meetings with remarkable manuscripts, and we're going to go back in time. We're going to look at the book and the author which is discussed in the chapter we've been looking at. We're going to take a look at the Canterbury Tales itself and Chaucer and the language that he used. Chaucer, of course, wrote in English, but he wrote in English many hundreds of years ago. And naturally, the English language has changed a lot in that time. Even the language of Shakespeare, which we consider to be very old, and many of us struggle to understand when we read it, even that language is more recent, much more recent than the language that Chaucer used. And so reading Chaucer's original language can be quite difficult to a 21st century reader. Most copies of the Canterbury Tales, like this one, will have a glossary somewhere or notes explaining many of the words which are not familiar to us because they're no longer used, or they're used differently, or they're spelt differently. And there are also plenty of modern English versions available too, where scholars have translated Chaucer's Old English into modern English to make it easier for us to understand. However, although many of these words may look very strange to us now, if we take a closer look at them, and if we attempt to read them out aloud, the meaning often becomes clear. For example, the rather bawdy Wife of Bath's tale in the Canterbury Tales. The wife of Bath is spelt W-Y-F. It doesn't look immediately like a word that we know. But if you try saying it aloud, it sounds like wife, which we now spell W-I-F-E. So it is actually the same word that we still use today. In addition to the Canterbury Tales, let's take a look at the poem that is mentioned in the chapter of Christopher de Hamel's book, where Chaucer, we assume, is writing about a scribe called Adam and telling him off for his careless work. On looking carefully at this poem and attempting to speak it out aloud, which can be difficult because unfortunately no one from Chaucer's time is still around to tell us how they pronounced words in those days. There are scholars who have made educated guesses, but we have no actual person from that time who can speak the way they spoke back then. So we can only guess and have a go at pronunciation. But if we try to pronounce some of these words, suddenly their meaning does start to become clear. If we look at this word with two Y's, scrivener, is rather like the word scrivener, and a scrivener is a scribe. And we're talking about Adam the scribe in this poem. So scrivener is a scribe. Then we have the word byfaller. If we change the way we pronounce that to be fall, we have the word befall. And then the word writen is right. The word spelt N-U-W-E, new. Well, if you're in Scotland and they say new, they mean now. And that's what that means here, now. The word making is very clear. There's only one letter different. A Y is now an I. And T-R-U-W-E is like newer, truer. It means true. Oft, with two F's and a T, is the same as often. And then a word that's very heavy on the consonants, negligence, is of course negligence. So the spellings may have changed, possibly the pronunciation has changed too, but the roots, the general gist of the words is still there, so we can make out quite a lot of what Chaucer says, and with the help of a glossary and notes from scholars who have studied Chaucer and his language in great detail, we can understand very well what Chaucer is writing about. And now it's writing prompt time. The Canterbury Tales is a story about a journey, and Meetings with Remarkable Manuscripts is also about 12 journeys made by Christopher de Hamel to meet 12 different manuscripts in 12 different towns and cities in different countries around the world. So first of all, sketch out a poem about a journey. Any journey you like, a journey you've made, a journey you've imagined. When you've sketched it out, take a clean sheet of paper and a nice pen or pencil, or a set of pens or pencils, and give your poem the medieval treatment. Write it out by hand as beautifully as you can, in as elegant handwriting as you can. Perhaps, if you are artistically inclined, add illustrations and illuminated letters to make your poem look as beautiful as possible. And if you like the end result, then maybe put it in a frame, put it in your wall, or perhaps even share it on our Facebook page so other written word students can enjoy it too. As always, the worksheet to accompany this lesson is available for you to download, and it contains copies of the extracts that we've read and all the other material we've discussed. Thank you for joining me in this lesson. I look forward to seeing you in the next one, and in the meantime, happy writing.